Welcome to Make It, a new weekly photography show where we'll be interviewing photographers to get into their heads and understand their creative style and approach. I'm Josh, and I'm your host. This week, we're talking with Ken Light, a documentary photographer. Let's go chat with Ken. Hi, Ken.
Hi, Josh. How are you?
I'm wonderful today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being on the show. It's really great to have you.
Yeah.
So, Ken, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm a documentary photographer. I work on long-term documentary projects, diving into a subject, spending sometimes a year, usually 4 or 5 years, going back over and over and trying to understand the people, the story I'm trying to tell, what the story is, and then creating books. So for me, the book form is really important as a photographer, getting the work out there, the editing, the sequencing, and the storytelling.
Cool. That's really awesome. Well, how did you get into it? Like, where did you come from as a photographer? Yeah,
so I started when I was 18. I was actually an anti-war organizer in that era, 1969, and my dad was an amateur photographer. I was around cameras. He one time let me actually take a roll of color film, which of course I put in the camera and kept shooting and shooting, and after about 40 exposures I realized the film had not taken up in the camera, but I continued.
Oh, you persevered.
I persevered. And when I went off to college in '69, young people didn't really have a voice. There was no internet, of course, and we turned to underground newspapers to tell our stories. And I began to photograph. And then in 1970, with the Cambodia invasion, it was a huge moment, and 4 or 5 days before the students were killed at Kent State, I had made some pictures in Ohio at Ohio State University. And those pictures of the National Guard on campus and tear gas and arrests and so forth appeared, got sent out all over the world. And you know, you're young, you're 19 years old, and your pictures are, you know, in Europe, in Latin America, and Africa, and it's kind of like, wow.
Right.
Photography is a voice. You can have a voice.
That's awesome, yeah.
And I think it was at that moment that I really decided that I could do this. You know, I wasn't really thinking about what the professional path was. How do you make money? I mean, that wasn't what was important to me. It was about making a photograph and telling a story.
Right, right. Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of curious about like the photography that you do, and how do you go through the process of coming up with a subject and then actually like bringing it through to fruition?
Well, my work has been about America, so I'm really interested in what happens in this country and what are the stories that I think are not seen, are not looked at by the mainstream media, or stories that maybe they dive in and they do, you know, a day or 2 days or 3 days, but there's very difference when you dive in for months and years, and you get to know the people, and you get to know you have a deeper understanding of what the story is about. And as well, you learn as a photographer, you know, how do I see, how do I make those pictures, how do I see differently, how do I put it together? It becomes kind of like a puzzle, you know, and you start on the edges where everything's nice and straight, and then you build to the inside until you have a fully formed story. The book form to me is really, really important because it allows me to have the most creative voice, where in a magazine maybe they're going to run, you know, 8 pictures. And a book then allows you to take pictures less seen, that tell a different part of the story. It can be more in depth.
Yeah, I'd love to take a look at one of your books and see how that kind of works together and understand your process of how you laid out the book and the story that you created.
Sure. So this is my book, What's Going On, my new book of my earliest photographs. And it's a little bit different than the process of the other books, which have been more about coming up with a theme, having a mantra about what the project is about, going out into the field, meeting people, developing the story, making contacts, and then spending a couple of weeks shooting. Because this is my early work. I mean, I was young. I had looked at books, you know, so Robert Frank's The Americans, Cartier-Bresson, Decisive Moment, Bruce Davidson, East 100th Street, Danny Lyon, Conversations of the Dead. I mean, these were all important books for me. So so these were the books I kind of grew up with as a young photographer, and they came out just as I was starting or shortly after I had started, and they kind of were almost a roadmap of of how to see and how to put things together. And I recommend, you know, if you're diving into a project, that you go out and you look at books.
Right.
And you see how people have put books together so you can get an idea of, you know, how you might do it. So this was a little bit more difficult. How do I tell the story of this period? I knew when it ended. Right. So the end was Richard Nixon resigning, and that was a good end for me. In the beginning, going through my early work, you know, and a photograph of kind of what life was like in 1969. And then the idea of kind of building the story, you know, July 4th on Long Island, people in West Oakland barbecuing, a roller rink in Ohio. I mean, these are all places that I went. And the book kind of builds kind of like a crescendo. Yeah. I mean, you want to build it, the story, and you see people changing. Nixon rally. This is actually John Kerry in 1971 as an anti-war activist. And then some of the early demonstrations. And then it kind of, you begin to see kids with long hair and you know, on the road, and there's this cultural change that happens. The Black Panthers, and then it kind of builds to, almost in the middle of the book, 1970, which for me was, as I said, this moment in which I kind of became a photographer. Even though I was photographing, I didn't really necessarily understand what I was seeing. And I had, you know, grown in that year of learning about f-stops and shutter speeds and making sure that there were no trees behind people's heads. I mean, you know, one of my great stories is when I first started, I thought every time I took a picture there was a tree running into the frame and going behind someone's head. And so you're learning all those really on the fly and by examining your pictures and really looking at your bad pictures. And that's probably one of the mistakes a lot of people don't do, is they don't look at they delete their bad pictures. Right. They don't look at them and really
learn from them.
They don't learn from them. And so really learning is about seeing the mistakes you've made and then knowing the next time you're in that situation, I shouldn't do this or I should do that. And then it kind of moves to the Women's March and things like the Buffalo Creek mine disaster. I got credentialed to go to the Republican Convention, which was kind of crazy, being a long-haired person. The Republican Convention in 1972 in Miami. And then going back into America. So there were both the political moments in this project, in this work, and there's also just my observation of America. So high school students, family in Yosemite, going west, a few rock concerts, right. Communities, and then the book has a natural ending with Nixon coming on television, resigning, and then going out the day of his resignation and photographing in West Oakland as a resident of West Oakland holds up the San Francisco Chronicle with right. Nixon resigns. So when you're doing a book, you really want to think about the book, the object. So you're thinking about the sequencing, the size. You're thinking about what are your end papers like. You're thinking about what is the back of the book. You're thinking about all these things. So one of the things I did was to create a maquette. And there are lots of different ways to do it. The one I'm doing now on my next book is more digital, so I'm taking the digital files and we're printing out the digital files. But with this book, literally, I just Xeroxed. I took the prints right. and I Xeroxed them, and I started out by cutting out the small Xeroxes and literally taping them on pages like right. this. Right. That gave me the ability to kind of move them around and sequence them, and things would change, and it gives you a sense of what the page spreads might look like. And then as I move from the kind of maquette to the actual physical object of the book, using InDesign and working with a designer, you know, we had ideas, and she had ideas, and you know, this picture should be big, and this picture, you know, there were some pages in which I just had one image, right. and we made those big. I didn't want too many big pictures, and then voila, you have a book.
Cool.
My book Witness in Our Time, Working Lives of Documentary Photographers, is interviews with about 24 of the top documentary photographers. And one of the things I thought that was important in this book was that, you know, people think someone like Sebastião Salgado was always that way. He always made those kind of photographs, and there's no sense that we all start at the same spot. We all start dazed and confused with our cameras.
Right.
We all are making mistakes. We all are making lots of bad photographs, but being persistent and really trying to understand your voice and what it is you're trying to say with a photograph and a camera, and also at the same time being conscious of the frame and the exposure and the light and the texture that is the wonderful part of being a photographer.
Yeah.
All these things combined will push you forward.
Well, thank you, Ken. And thanks for watching our new show, Make It. Make sure you come back next week on the same channel to see what we're talking about next week with another photographer on another topic. See ya.